What's going on, ladies, gents, and kids of all ages? It is Eric coming back at you once again from the Nerd Cave, and today I have a very exciting deck tech video for you. This is actually a deck that I didn't originate. This was a deck that made top 64 at DLC Vegas. I think it's really super interesting. I know a lot of people are talking about Zan Syed's deck, which is fantastic. Super cool to see something outside of the three meta staples that we expected to be largely participating in the tournament. When the tournament actually came down to Emerald Steel against Emerald Steel, which is kind of crazy. I think a lot of people would have bet on the other decks that were taking up about 75% of the meta at the DLC Vegas, which were Sapphire Ruby, Ruby Amethyst, and Amber Steel. Each one was representing somewhere between 20 and 25% of the meta at the DLC, but came down to Emerald Steel two times. But like I said, everybody's been talking about that deck, so we're not going to be talking about Emerald Steel today. We are going to be talking about a Ruby Steel deck that made top 64. And I think it's really super interesting. The first card that I talk about, you'll be like, oh, same old, same old. Then like 75% of the cards after that, you're going to be like, wow, that's not a card that I see played a whole lot. That being said, as always, big shout out to the Patreons making the giveaways on the channel possible, supporting the channel behind the scenes. You are hugely, hugely beneficial to the channel, and we appreciate you a ton. We could not do this without you, especially those giveaways. If I haven't said this enough recently, another giveaway is coming at 2,000 subscribers. We're about 200 subscribers away, so if you haven't slapped that subscribe button, now is a great time to do so. Get entered into that giveaway that's going to be coming up at 2,000 subscribers. Without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this Ruby Steel deck list. So the first card we're going to be playing, and one of only two 1-drops in the deck, which I thought was kind of interesting, is going to be Robin Hood Beloved Outlaw, a 1-cost inkable 2/2 character questing for 1. You know him, you love him, he is here. You may have guessed it, as a shift target, because he serves no other purpose in the meta than to shift into the big Robin Hood. But we are on 4 of those. Next up, we have 4 of Happy Lively Night, a 1-cost 2/1 character. Great early game answer to Diablo if they aren't able to deal with him with direct removal, because they are going to want to get that Diablo exerted as soon as possible. And during your turn, this character is going to gain evasive. He is attacking for 2, so he is going to be able to trade with Diablo. Also trade with some of those other small evasive characters if it is relevant at the time. But in those instances, maybe you just end up questing. But Happy, super good. A happy and interesting card to see being played in a 4-up. Not really something we've seen in the meta so much. Then we are on one of my personal favorite steel cards for Mr. Smee, Bumbling Mate. If you saw my top 17 cards in Lorcana right now video, I did include Mr. Smee among those cards. I really think he is that good. He's a 2-cost inkable 3/3 character, so crazy stat line for 2, especially being inkable. Questing for 2, which just pushes him even further over that fantastic line. And at the end of your turn, if this character is exerted and you don't have a captain character in play, he is going to deal 1 damage to himself, so he only can potentially get a few quests in if you don't have that captain out, but still a 3/3 stat line for 2. He's trading with foxes, trading with snakes, trading with most early game characters. The only thing he doesn't trade with is Daisy, but he'll kill Daisy on 2. Then another 2-cost character. We are on 4, Flynn Rider, Frenemy, which you'll see real soon why we're on 4 of these. He is a 2-cost inkable character, 2/2. He's kind of gone out of favor a little bit in the current meta because so many people are playing Amber Steel. Amber Steel deals with him pretty readily. Brawl will deal with him. Brawl does eat up a turn, so Brawl is almost in your favor in some instances. In the Amber Steel matchup, he's generally not going to be great, particularly in the early game. He's a 2/2 character. At the start of your turn, if you have a character in play with more attack than each opposing character, so if your strongest character is stronger than their strongest character, in other words, you're going to go ahead and net 3 lore, which is a crazy amount of lore, especially in the early game. And he does have the potential to quest for 1 if you do want to risk him with a quest, which generally with this deck you don't. Then we are on 4 Seven Dwarves Mine. This is a new location, something we haven't really seen getting a ton of play, but is definitely a pretty good card. It is 2-cost inkable location, does net you 1 passive lore each turn. It does cost 2 to move a character in there, which is, you know, high. Most people are favoring locations that only cost 1 to move in, and it does only have 6 willpower, so it does die to things like Maui. So it's something you want to get out very situationally, particularly when you have control of the board already. And during your turn, the first time you move a character here, you may deal 1 damage to chosen character. If the moved character is a knight, deal 2 damage instead. So if you get a couple of these down with a knight on board, bounce them back and forth, forth. You can go ahead and deal 4 damage every turn, which is definitely not insignificant. So it's just one of those cards you want to play when the field is clear, play when it's appropriate, play preferably not into Maui. It's definitely better in that steel matchup where they have lower attack characters and aren't going to be able to take it out as so easily. Then the last 2 drop in the deck, and another Knight character. We do have 4 Doc Bold Knight, a 2-cost uninkable. This is a character I've been talking about pretty much since the new set came out. I think he's really good personally. I think he's particularly good in decks that aren't already drawing a lot of cards. We have so many decks drawing a ton of cards already, so that has made him less favored in the meta in the current meta steel options that are using other things to do their card draw. But when you play this character, you may discard your hand to draw 2 cards. This is relevant in 2 ways, because if you have a ton of cards in your hand and you have a Tiana on deck, we'll talk more about Tiana later, and you want to get rid of those cards in your hand, you could potentially play Doc, discard whatever cards are in your hand, if that is the best play, ink one of the cards you draw, play another card that you draw potentially, especially because the curve of this deck is particularly low, and then you have an empty hand with Tiana on the board to shut off all actions during your opponent's turn. So Doc can do some shenanigan stuff in this deck, and he is a 1/3 questing for 1, which is a decent stat line for 2. Then next up in the 3-drop slot, another way to shut off those pesky actions, we are on 4 Pete Games Referee. He is a 3-cost inkable character, 3/3 stat line. So again, trading with those foxes, trading with those snakes, which makes him really good. When you play this character, opponents can't play actions until the start of your next turn, so really until the start of their next turn, because there are no instant speed actions, and he does quest for 1, so he is a small quester, but he has a solid stat line, and the ability to shut off actions is absolutely gross in the meta. Pretty much everyone's playing actions in their deck, except for this deck. This deck runs 0 actions, which I think makes it even more interesting. I think it is worth noting that top 64 at the DLC is the top 3% of decks. There was, from my understanding, there was around a 2,000 player base there, but at 2,000 players, top 64 decks is roughly 3% of the meta, so it's nothing to shake a stick at. I know this deck may not have won, but it did quite well against many decks that are relevant in the meta right now. But we do have Benja, a 3-cost inkable 2/3 character, questing for 2, which is amazing. When you play this character, you may banish chosen items, so he's going to be a great way to deal with those fishbone quills in the early game. If you've made it so far into the game that you're worried about Lucky Dime, things are probably already going sideways for you, but really you're going to want to deal with fishbone quill with him. If it's further in the late game and you're still scraping it out, by all means destroy a Lucky Dime with him, but things can get a little sketchier in the late game because this is a more aggro heavy deck. Then we have a 3-cost John Silver Greedy Treasure Seeker, 3-cost inkable 3/3 stat line again. So those 3-cost 3/3s, that is a solid stat line. I can't state that enough. This is a card that I was hot on. You may have seen me talk about him previously in a Pirates deck. I think he's really good. He's also particularly good with Smee, being that he is a captain, so he's going to prevent Smee from taking that damage, and he's on curb with Smee. So turn 2 Smee, turn 3 John Silver. And for each location you have him play, this character gains resist +1 and gets +1 lore. So if you can get a couple locations down, he is potentially a 3/3 resist 2 questing for 3, which is absolutely bonkers. It is obviously contingent on some things happening successfully with your field, but still really good. This is a card I've been pretty excited about since it came out, hence why I have 2 foils of it, but I haven't found a great deck for it. I've tried it in a couple different things, and that is Gustav the Giant, Terror of the Kingdom, a 3-cost inkable character with a 6/6 stat line. The thing that makes that balanced out, we're going to talk about right now. This character enters play exerted and can't ready at the start of your turn. So kind of a bummer there. He doesn't need to be ready to trigger Flynn's ability. So going turn 2 Flynn, turn 3 Gustav, you now have a 6/6 out that they can only really deal with Maui. If they're not able to deal with your Flynn, this is probably going to be netting you 3 lore at the beginning of your next turn. During your turn, whenever one of your characters banishes another character in a challenge, you may ready this character, and he does quest for 1. More relevantly, he's probably going to be attacking and just absolutely blowing up the board with that 6/6 stat line. Super good on curve with Super Goof. Like if you can go turn 2 Flynn, turn 3 Gustav, turn 4 Super Goof, Super Goof can potentially take something out, ready him up into turn 4. He can bash something out himself, and you're netting that 3 lore with Flynn. Just kind of a crazy play line that people aren't going to see coming or really know how to play around, because this isn't a deck that's seen a lot of play. Then last up in the 3-drop slot, card I've steered away from personally in Ruby Amethyst, but it's fantastic and I probably should just play without Flynn, is Sisu Emboldened Warrior, a 3-cost inkable character, a 1/4 stat line, however that can change. She is questing for 2, which is great on a 3-cost character, and this character gets +1 attack for each card in your opponent's hand. So particularly when she's coming into play, your opponent's likely to have several cards in their hand unless they're also playing this deck, and she is going to be powered up quite a bit. Another great way to take advantage of that Flynn, potentially be able to get yourself some sneaky lore, which is always great, and potentially a way to bash out characters that are in your way. But Sisu, probably one of the best characters. I believe she was also on my list of top 17 cards in the game right now. Then we do have 3 Tiana Celebrating Princess. I have a tendency to buy starter decks just to get the foils that are in them, and so I had done that during the set, bought some starters, so I do have some foil Tianas, which I like to play when I can. So I was excited to see her in this list. She is a 4-cost uninkable character, 1/4 stat line, so she does die to Brawl if her ability isn't activated. But she is a resist +2 questing for 2, which is fantastic, so Maui can kill her in a challenge and most other things can't. While this character is exerted and you have no cards in your hand, opponents can't play actions at all. So she does have to be exerted. This deck is playing something that could potentially allow her to be exerted safely, which is kind of interesting. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. But Tiana, really good way to just kind of shut off what your opponent is doing, at least for some turns. Then we have 2 Prince Eric Expert Helmsman, a 4-cost uninkable character, so another uninkable in the deck. I think this deck was on 13 uninkables if I'm not mistaken. He's a 2/2 questing for 2, so 2/2 not a great stat line for 4, until you start talking about his ability, which is when this character is banished, you may banish chosen character. Just straight up, any character, doesn't matter what it is, as long as it doesn't have ward, Prince Eric can banish it. The only way for your opponent to get around this is to do something like Under the Sea or Let It Go, where he's not getting banished. Hades would also work, but Hades has kind of fallen out of favor, so I don't know how relevant he is to the current meta, but Prince Eric Expert Helmsman, card that I think is great. Again, that's why I have foils of them. I was playing this in Ruby Amethyst during last set, and I'm happy to see it coming back in this deck during this set. Next up in the 4-cost slot, we do have another uninkable. A lot of our uninkables are 4-cost apparently, is RLS Legacy Solar Galleon. Love this card. Reppin' Treasure Planet, which is probably one of my favorite Disney movies. That's one I didn't see until I was an adult, but really, really good. If you've never seen it, check it out. It's a 4-cost uninkable location, 8 willpower, which is great. Keeps it out of dying to most anything in the meta in 1 attack. 3 to move in, which is a little expensive. Characters gain evasive while they're here. It's a great later game way to deal with not only those evasives that are out there, but to deal with those Diablos if they are still coming around. If you have a character here, you may pay 2 less to move characters here. So once you get 1 character in there, any other characters are going to cost 1 to move in as long as there's a character in there. So that is a lot more reasonable of a move-in cost. They are all going to gain evasive when they're in there, and this is going to be netting you 2 passive lore every turn. Super, super aggressive card. Really good with Jim Hawkins, which, as you may have imagined, we are playing. Last up in the 4-drop slot, and then we'll talk about the couple 5-drops we have in the deck. We do have 4 Goofy Super Goof, 4-cost inkable character, 2/4 stat line, so kind of an stat line for a 4-cost. Does have rush, so it's coming in and attacking right away. If you're Magic players, haste, they call it rush in this game. Questing for 1 lore. Whenever this character challenges another character, gain 2 lore. So great way to close out games, netting you more potential lore right away than something like Goat would, and coming down for the same cost. You don't have to banish a character in that challenge, you just have to challenge something to go ahead and gain that 2 lore. So Super Goof, great way to close out games. He is also, like I mentioned, fantastic on curve with Gustav, where he is going to be able to go ahead and bang on something on turn 4, potentially banish it. If he does banish something on that turn 4, your Gustav is going to get busy. And a lot of times if you're on like the Flynn Gustav line, they're going to try to bait out attacks with your Flynn, so you can kind of surprise them with something like Super Goof to banish that instead. Then one of our 2 5-costs in the deck, we do have Robin Hood, Champion of Sherwood, a 5-cost inkable characters. 4 of these in the deck. 3/6 stat line, questing for 2, shifting for 3, so coming down very early in the game, which is fantastic. Very on curve with some of the other things that you're trying to do. It's not great with Flynn, but generally when you're on the turn 3 Robin Hood play line, you're not necessarily focused on the Flynn play line. You're doing something different. It's really good into something like Steel Song, where Flynn doesn't shine as much. During your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, you're going to gain 2 lore, so it can potentially banish characters and still net you lore. Good good potentially with Gustav, which is, not saying don't use them with Gustav, just saying with Flynn, he's not necessarily where you want to be on turn 3. And when this character is banished in a challenge, you may draw a card. So he is going to replace himself. That draw is super, super necessary in this deck, where you are essentially in a desert draw-wise. There's really not anything you drawing you cards in this deck. That's why I will say the mulligan with this deck is very important. That first game may be tough. It's important to know what you're playing into when you can, and mulligan effectively. And the last card in the deck, we are on 3 Jim Hawkins. Again, repping Treasure Planet. I always love to see Jim Hawkins in a deck. That was one of my favorite things about playing my kind of own version of the Towelman Purple list. That was Amber Ruby and Ram Jim Hawkins with Just in Time. You Just in Time on turn 3. If you haven't seen that deck list, definitely go check it out. I'll throw a link on screen. But he is a 5-cost inkable character for 4 stat line, which is great for getting around those Medusas and other things that are going to be happening on 6. When you play this character, you may play a location with cost 4 or less for free, which is fantastic. So you'll be able to potentially get that RLS Legacy out for free if you have it, or even getting the 7 Dwarves Mine out can definitely be good. And when you play a location, this character is going to go ahead and move there for free, so you can move him into that 7 Dwarves Mine, deal 1 damage to something, and then in the following turns potentially try to move some Knights in there and deal 2 damage every turn, which could be really good. Or, like I mentioned, even better yet, go ahead and get the RLS Legacy out. He is also a 4/4 questing for 2, so a great way to keep that lore pressure on. But Jim Hawkins, another card that's fallen out of favor in the meta, but in this deck really shines. The way that all of these cards work together is fantastic to me because it's playing so many non-meta options. But that is the full breakdown of the deck list. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think Ruby Steel could potentially be a real meta contender? What do you think it's going to struggle with the most? Is it going to be that Emerald Steel deck, Ruby Amethyst, Ruby Sapphire, or Amber Steel? It's really hard for me to say. I think the deck could potentially be good into anything if you take advantage of your play lines correctly. Even that discard deck is kind of funny because by the time they're really trying to make you discard heavily, you have already played out your entire hand potentially, and you're not drawing enough cards for them to have anything to make you discard. If they Ursula you, either are not getting any value out of it because you're not playing actions. So I think the deck is really pretty interesting in the meta. I think a lot of people are going to be playing Emerald Steel because of Zan Syed's win. If you haven't seen that deck list, highly recommend checking it out. I won't be covering it on the channel again because so many people are covering it already, but thank you guys so much for sticking around to the end. If you haven't checked out the Nerd Cave merch shop, definitely check that out as NerdCave.shop. We've got some great shirts over there, including the Rabbit Recycler shirt, which has been very popular. And when you see those toys, video games, and weird off-meta decks featuring Tiana off in the distance, remember, it is not a mirage. You guys have a great day.